wider. Well, hello, internets. This is John Ficarra, and welcome to Ficarra Classic. We're going live for the first time to answer your questions on my video on the Porsche 917 that I did on VINwiki. And I already have some comments, and I've got questions from the internet, so I'm going to do my best to answer as many of them as I can, and as accurately as I can, doing all this off the top of my head. I'm not going to be looking at any books, so we'll see how it goes. Question from the 917 video. Is there a reason they changed the Gulf livery on the cars to have different patterns? Well, they did that because back in the day, race cars did not have transponders. And what transponders are, they're the little gizmo that tracks the car going around for modern race cars, lets you know when it goes around for the finish line each time, and so forth. It gives telemetry in the car. Back then, it was just some guy on the side with his clipboard and a couple of stopwatches looking at the cars. So they had to distinguish between the cars or what they look like. So in 70, the Gulf cars at Le Mans, each one looked a little bit different. The same thing at Daytona. There was one with a stripe down the center. That was the number 2 car. Well, the numbers would change, but the stripe down the middle. Then you'd have one with kind of a stripe across the front and looked like kind of a mustache. And the joke was that was Joe Sifford's car, because Joe Sifford had his trademark mustache. And then one of the cars just had an orange roof. But all those liveries were there for people to keep track of the cars. Plus, they looked awesome. And if you get to see like the old 908s in the Gulf livery, the cars they ran in the Targa, they had this, even I think it's one of the coolest liveries. It's the blue and the orange, but it's got a big arrow going down the front of it, and it's super awesome. So yeah, they changed the liveries just for identification purposes. All right, let's take one from you guys here. Let's see. Well, somebody just asked what 917 ended up with such iconic wild liveries. Well, liveries really, until the 70s was kind of a high point, because you had a lot of new sponsorship. So teams being sponsored by major corporations didn't come in until the 60s. And in the 70s, it was in full tilt. So you had like the Martini livery, which was beautiful. Then it was also the late 60s, early 70s. So you had a lot of real wild art. So you got things like the hippie car, and people were pulling things off like the pig, which we'll talk about in a second. But yeah, there were some great liveries back there. The Gulf livery, just beautiful stuff, before cars just got splattered with advertising, and that's all you can see now. Let's take one from here. Did the 917 have a boxer engine? Okay, first of all, what the heck's a boxer engine? Boxer engine is how the pistons move in and out. So they had the engine, flat engine, and the pistons would go like this. So it's kind of like a boxer going out like that. And the early Porsche engines were boxer engines. The 917 engine was different. It was essentially what they called a flat V12. Even though it was a flat motor, they called it a 180-degree V12 because the pistons moved in and out just like you would have in kind of a V motor like that. So it was not a boxer engine. Okay, what is with the Lola photo? So everybody pointed out in the video, yes, there was I say something about a Ferrari 512, and a picture of a Lola comes up. Now, Ed and his team do the best that they can, making these videos super accurate, especially when the video is not about a hooker and a Lamborghini. We're trying to be accurate historically about things. We sometimes mess up. And that car was a Lola. It's in the similar livery as the Penske 512 was, and I can see the mix-up happening there. So apologize for that photo. We do our best. All right. Let's see some questions. How many original 917s were converted to streetcars? Well, that actually leads to a couple of questions we had on. There was the Count Rossi car that was really famous, that people would see running around. That was actually, I think it was chassis 30. And that car, I think, raced like once and crashed, and he got it. And in 1974, he puts, like, really all he did was put some mufflers on it. kept it pretty much as a race car and drove it around. There's pictures on the internet of that. It's super cool. And there was another one later on, um, that was made from a scrap car in like 1977 by Mr. Grossman, I think. So there were a couple of them, and usually the damaged, messed up cars. It wasn't like somebody took one of the championship cars and put it on the street. But yeah, people did drive 917s. There's guys out there who are driving 962s on the street. If you're a millionaire, then why the heck not? Um, let's see. Let's take one from the video. Oh, here's this good. This wasn't actually a question; it was an observation, which I liked. Never would have guessed there was so much interesting history behind the rival's cool-looking car from Herbie Goes to Monte Carlo. So, if you haven't seen the Herbie movies, you totally should. The Herbie Goes to Monte Carlo, the villain is in what looks to be a 917, and it's actually a laser 917, which was a kit car. It wasn't actually a 917 in that movie, but I just love that that's the connection to the 917 is Herbie Goes to Monte Carlo. Um, I heard about the wooden shift knob. What was that all about? Yeah, so I there's only so much I could fit in a video. I really wanted to talk about that. And the wooden shift knob. There's a great article in a magazine called Triple Zero, which you should totally get. It's an amazing Porsche only magazine, super deep geek stuff. And they have a whole article with the photographs of like every shift knob in a 917. And they were wood, and they're kind of layered wood, and they're made out of birch and different woods. And the story goes is that they put them in there because there was a lot of heat in the 917, and that the metal shift knobs would get super hot. So that they put on a wood shift knob. There's also the theory that it was lighter than a wood. I mean, the wood was lighter than a metal shift knob. Uh, but you'll see that knob comes back in the Carrera GT. There's odes to that original 917 knob, and you can buy them on the internet for your Porsche, which is pretty cool. Let's see what folks got here. Um, could you give us some more stories about the 91730? I will. I will. So I'm going to do a whole video on the Can-Am era. I only had so much time. I rattled on and on. The VINwiki video is edited down from about probably 30, 40 minutes of me just yambling. So uh, I will do a whole nother video on the Can-Am cars. I kind of separate them from the endurance cars because it was a whole nother development of the 917. But I'll get into some of the details of that. 91710 and the 91730 were Can-Am cars. Uh, but we'll get to that. Let's see. Let's look at. I know. Oh, well, there's people have been asking me about the shirt. Like, where do I get the 917 cooling fan shirt? I'm sorry. It's just like the shirt I was wearing in the 959 video. This was made for Rennsport a few years ago by my friend Zach Todd and his company. And the company since then has shut down. But this is the cooling fan from the 917. And I've actually asked Zach if maybe we could make some more of these shirts, like make them Fakara Classic shirts. And he seems to be into it. So if you guys are interested, maybe we'll make up some cool shirts like this. Do, do, do. How can you talk about the 917 for 23 minutes without mentioning arguably the best livery ever made, the Pink Pig? Okay, I did skip over the Pink Pig, and I apologize. I apologize to Kelly Telfer, a friend of mine who actually now has an actual giant pig he painted pink and put the whole thing on. It was at uh, Porsche Works in Amelia Island. It's an amazing thing. But the Pink Pig was a development of the 917, and it was a flash in the pan. What they were trying to do was make a car that had the handling and stability of a 917K with the overall top speed of the long tail. And didn't quite work, but the paint job totally did. And what they did was, look it up on the internet. Just look at Porsche Pink Pig, and it's a big pink race car with the cuts of meat all over it. And it is one of the most imaginative and amazing car liveries, really, ever. And a friend of mine actually has a speedster with that on there as well, a fake speedster, but a speedster nonetheless. Um, let's see. Let's see here. I know you worked at Canapa in Scotts Valley. Did you ever have hands-on experience with his 917K? If so, what was it like? Well, working for Bruce Canepa, you're going to have access to some amazing automobiles, and I was very, very fortunate to have worked there and been able to see and touch them. And he actually has multiple 917s. He's got two Gulf cars. The one he's famous for is the 1970 Daytona car, and he also has which is chassis 15/35, and then he's got chassis 4/17, which has number 9 on it right now, and I think that car is still for sale. And he also has one of the inner series cars, which was the inner series, kind of like the Can-Am in Europe, and he has one of the 91710s of that. And I got to sit in and have my lunch in a lot of those cars. I pretty much sat in all of them. I can tell you something. I do not fit in a 917K. I am 6'3", and there's just no room for my size. Like, I don't think Dan Gurney would have ever been able to squeeze into one without a huge Gurney bubble over his head. Uh, it was delightful. I mean, we worked on their 91710 was a restoration, 91730, the car that actually won the championship in '73. Its new owner is actually going to have it out on display. You're going to see it everywhere, so that's kind of exciting. Um, and They actually brought in that's chassis 3 of 91730s. They brought in chassis 4, which looked like chassis 3, and then he painted it white. And the new owner is a rather large guy like myself, so I got to sit in it while they fitted me into the car. So I can imagine I was being fitted for a 91730 as they moved the seat and stuff around. But I never got to drive one. I will admit I don't know. Uh, that would be a real privilege to be able to drive one. I did sit in it and steer it as we moved it from the museum to the front of the building, but that was it. I never drove it. That's all Bruce's baby. And really, would you really want to get behind the wheel of a $20 million car? No. Let's see. Let's see. I'm going to try to answer as many of these questions as I can. Um, uh, do you ever heard about fake 911s being sold as originals? Saw a video about a Porsche specialist in Germany talking about it a couple years ago. Yeah, it happens. It, it's weird. I don't want to go on record of saying what car and what chassis and things like that. But there have been, when a car gets into the huge figures that 917s are, there's going to be a temptation to recreate one or find a number that hasn't been used, or resurrecting a crashed car. Um, so there have been some shenanigans in the 917 world, but there's a lot of fantastic experts out there who catch those kind of things and keep us from seeing the fakes. But like, and there's intentional fakes, by the way. Like the car that won 1970 Le Mans, the Salzburg car, is a 917K. Very cool livery, number 23, and it was actually the car that won was actually chassis 23. But the one you see in the Porsche Museum isn't that car. It's chassis 1 that Porsche themselves dressed up to look like the championship car from 1970. So is it a fake? It's a dressed up, yeah, it's a fake. Porsche wanted you to see it. They built it, but it's actually chassis 1. Chassis 23 is still out there in the correct livery. Some people want Porsche to change chassis 1 back to what it was originally, but that's way above my pay grade. Um, yeah, people want to hear about the 91730. Okay, we'll get to the 91730. I'm going to do a video on them, but let's work into that by answering this question about engine power, because really that's the question people always have on the Can-Am cars. Here's what: so did the later Can-Am cars really put out 1,200 horsepower? That was the figure I used to hear, but I don't know if it's true. You said 550 horsepower in a video for the early cars. How did the horsepower output change over the life of the car? Um, and then another question was like, how much did the final version of the engine make? it was at 1,280 horsepower. There's lots of numbers out there. The 4.5 liter put out when that started was 550 horsepower. Then they made a 4.9 liter, had a lot more torque. That went up to like 590 horsepower. They finally built a 5 liter, which was the maximum for the class, and that was like 620 horsepower. So the original normally aspirated engine really topped out in the 600s. Then what happened was they went to Can-Am, and Can-Am is one of the greatest race series of all time. And the reason is that there was very, very few rules. You know, if it had four wheels on it and a windshield that big, you know, they called it a race car. And Porsche went to town with turbo technology, which was pretty new at the time. And they put turbochargers on these 917 motors. They eventually built them up to 5.4 liters. And the 91710 could put out, that's the 72 car. That car could put out 1,100, maybe 1,200 horsepower. And it was pretty monstrous because the McLarens and the McLaren V8s and the V8s they were using at the time, which were big Chevrolet V8s, they were at least 100, 200 horsepower down. And what they would do is they had qualifying kind of, they could boost it up to the big 1,100 horsepower. Then in the race, they would back it down to 900 horsepower and still have 100 horsepower to beat the other teams. And of course, they ran away and won in 72. In 73, Penske and Porsche put together the 917-30, which was the ultimate, some say the ultimate 917. And that car put out a monstrous amount of power. So there's rumors that, you know, it went up to 1,560 horsepower. And I can say that mathematically it's true, because back then they actually didn't have a dyno that went over 1,000 horsepower. So it wasn't like they were putting these things on a dyno and going like we do today and just be like, oh yeah, it makes this, and this. So over 1,000 horsepower, they had to mathematically figure it out, and that's the horsepower they were making. Now, the ultimate version, the fastest version of the 917-30 was the Cam 2 car that ran at Talladega in 1975 that set the closed course speed record at like 221 miles an hour. And that record stood for years. And what they actually did is they went back to the 5 liter engine and they added intercoolers. And if you know about turbos, intercoolers help make the fuel charge much more dense, the air cooler, and that car probably wicked up into that wicked high horsepower rating. Now they wouldn't race them like that. So the 917-30, they probably raced it at 1,100 horsepower, which is still insane. And it was the reason that car could literally lap the field. That car could lap second place. And they called the 917-30 the car that killed Can-Am. I disagree with that, but I'll talk about that in my 917-30 video, the Can-Am video, at some point. There's some really. John Harrison just said the Can-Am killer. You and I are gonna have some words, Mr. Harrison. Let's see. Nice, there's some good stuff here. There's a few people are dominating the questions. You guys have some really excellent questions. Why was it named the 917? Where does Porsche get the names? I don't know. Actually, that's a really good question. I don't, or if I did know, I've forgotten. I don't know where the specific reason for that designation. The really interesting thing is that the engine is called the 912. The car jumped from they had the 906, then they had the 910, and then the 907 and 908, and then we went 917. So there's probably some brilliant people out there who know that better than I do. Let's see. Oh, here's something. So people ask me like what books. So are there any books written about the story of this car? What are some books that tell the real stories? This one, what would you recommend? There's a lot of books on the 917. I mean, there's a gajillion books on Porsche. You can buy pretty much any book on Porsche, and there's going to be something in there about the 917. But I'm not filming from my my studio because my internet stinks at my house. So I don't have all my books here, but I brought a couple. This one's kind of fun. And this is 917 Owner's Workshop Manual by Haynes. I actually contributed to this book when I was at Canapa, and it's not a super in-depth book, but it's a fun, not expensive, because a lot of these books get really expensive. It's a fun way to kind of just glance over the entire history of the 917. And that's just a fun start book. My first book on the 917 I ever owned was this book, Porsche 917, The Winning Formula, and that's by Peter Morgan, and that actually gets in a little bit more detail than the kind of tome I start with a lot of my research with Porsche, and what a lot of people do, was a book called Excellence Was Expected, by Karl Ludvigsen. And he wrote, it is a tome, it's a 3-volume set, and now we're getting into the expensive books, because a set of that costs a few $100, but man, it is amazingly detailed. That book covers just about all the little kind of weird geeky details that I love to pick out. They're all in that book. I can highly recommend that. It's not, we found out over the years, because it's an older book, that maybe some of the things weren't like 100% accurate, but car history is about trying to find the best truth, and then keeping your mind open that there might be another truth that people misremember, or something wrong. So we're always open to new information. Speaking of new information, another great book is Gulf 917 by Jay Gillotti. And Jay actually wrote me after the video and said, it was really, really nice. And he's like, well, you made a few mistakes. And I'm like, I'm going to make mistakes. And he actually sent me like a bunch of notes on little corrections. And most of them are very little small corrections. But I really, to my shame, I don't actually have his book on my shelf, and I've rectified that. I've ordered it. But his details, like literally, the man wrote a book on the 917, and his details and notes are amazing. And some of them are just little geeky facts. He said that John Ware. All right. So I say John Ware. That's because I had a friend named David Ware, and that's how he pronounced his name. I understand that people say John Wire, and it's probably the way you pronounce it. I'm really bad at pronouncing names, and I apologize to all the families and people, names I have messed up over the years. But I read most of this. I haven't actually met them, because most of them are gone. So I don't have the access to how you say their names. So I mess up names. I try to get them right. So let's call him Mr. Wire. Said Wire was not present when they won Le Mans for the second time in 1969 with a GT40. His wife was ill, and the team conducted the race without him. Then he also says Mr. Wire was not present at the Zeltweg test. He was home nursing a broken elbow. It was John Horseman and David York were there, which we talked about in the video. That's the part where we talked about the bugs hitting the tail and the nets, and they had to change the rear end. And so poor Mr. Wire, actually, man, he didn't he had got some bad luck there. And one interesting thing that he did point out that I didn't know. So I talked about them cutting the tail off. Now they modified the tail at the track to figure out the bad airflow over the rear of the 917. He says they did not cut the rear end off the car. They were testing the short tail and just built Horseman's ramp tail on top of the existing tail, which you can see in the pictures, using the raised flaps as part of the support for the sheet metal. The flaps connected to the suspension were long gone by October 1969. They were banned by the FIA as a movable aerodynamic device before Le Mans, although they did allow Porsche to use them in the Le Mans race. So, Jay, thank you for all of this. I don't have time to go through all of it, but I'm always open to corrections. I'm always open to new information, and that's wonderful. So check out Jay Gillotti's book, Gulf 917, and give some authors some support. All right, let's look at your questions. I heard about the gear level changing position without drivers shifting. Could you talk about the circumstances in which that would happen? Did it go back by itself? And somebody asked, somebody else asked that question on the 917 video. I I haven't heard about that. I would have to ask a couple of people, and I'm glad to come back and find out. Um, I did I did hear that some of this the shifting pattern, the way the shifter worked could get confusing, and there was times where you could jam or confuse a couple of the gears. Joe Siffert uh, notoriously blew up an engine right in front of the pits at Le Mans at a misshift. But it's not going to wander around. There's a lot of linkage going on. There's a lot of vibration. You can imagine what it's like inside one of those cars. So I can imagine that something like that would happen, but I don't have any knowledge of that, which doesn't mean there's not knowledge out there. Um, let's see. Y'all having fun? Is this going okay? Okay, let's talk about Le Mans. So people asked what car won Le Mans, because I don't in the video I don't go do in deep detail about the races themselves, because obviously, like my Ferrari video that I did on Le Mans, I can do an entire video on one race. So I didn't want to get into too much detail. They did win Le Mans both times. Um, so the car that won in 1970, the story is it wasn't the car that was supposed to win. There were a lot of 917s lined up, and the Gulf cars were all there. There were three Gulf cars. We talked about their liveries earlier, and none of them finished. In fact, Wire, their team never won Le Mans. It was a Salzburg car, and it was a 4.5 liter 917K. The car that was supposed to win was this special 4.9 liter long tail, and it's a wicked looking car. And it put down, I think it actually qualified first, and it was going to be an all winning car. But it's a 24-hour race. You have to finish to win, and the car that won was the old reliable 4.5 liter 917K of Porsche Salzburg. And another great car that was in that race, of course, was the Martini hippie livery long tail. And yeah, and here it is right there. See, in a matchbox. This is as close as I'm ever going to get to owning a 917 right there. So that car, one of the greatest liveries ever. That car came in second, I believe. Um, there were like 68 cars entered. I think only 7 finished Le Mans that year. But it was that was chassis 23 that won Le Mans in 1970. Now, in 1971, again, they had long tails out there. They had a bunch of special cars. There was all this talk of finally the long tail's going to win. But again, a 917K wins. But it was a special one. It was a magnesium chassis one that was put out there by Martini Racing. And I think there were only 3 magnesium chassis cars. And that was driven by Helmut Marko, who you might know if you follow Formula One. He's one of the big gurus at Red Bull. So when you see him back there, like my son didn't know this, but I'm like, he won Le Mans. He's not just some old guy giving advice. That guy was there. And that was chassis 53. So by saying chassis 53, you can tell there were more 917s built than the original 25. They kept building chassis for development, and also to replace broken chassis. I mentioned earlier Bruce Ganepa's car is called chassis 15/35, and there was chassis 4/17. That's because 4 got cracked up, and they brought number 17 chassis in and dropped it where the number 4 chassis was. This is all kind of weird, tricky stuff back in the day. And this is when you get really geeky. So they took the 4 chassis, sent it back to Germany, but took the tag off the 4 chassis and put it on the 17 chassis so it could keep racing, because the cars back then had like basically a car passport called a carnet, and they didn't want to have to fill out new paperwork for chassis 17, so they just made it chassis 4. So chassis 4, the real chassis 4, goes back to Germany. They slap it with chassis 17 number on it, and you can see how things get kind of crazy. But there were over 50 chassis built. And a lot of them don't exist because they were race cars and they got cracked up and destroyed. So that's the 2 years at Le Mans. They won Le Mans both years. They won Daytona both years. They didn't win Sebring the first year, but they won Sebring the second year. So all the major endurance races they conquered with the 917, including winning the world championship both years. All right, let's look on here. What did the flat 12 rev to? Good question. So there's actually a quote, and I might get this wrong, but Brian Redman said that the 917 engine would rev all day to 8,200 RPM, but would blow up at 8,400 RPM. That there was a limit to its reliability. Um, and I don't think the guys who are driving them today are ringing them that hard. Well, I got to take that back. Bruce Canepa beats the hell out of his. So I can say Bruce is pushing his pretty close to the limit. In fact, there was a time at one of the historics, he was racing against Brian Redman in a 908 going through the corkscrew, and they were dicing it out. There were a few 917s on the track. It's always wonderful. I always recommend go out to your local historics and support them. You see these cars in action. They're not supposed to be just pictures on your computer. Go hear them do their thing. Um, but they were out there duking it out. And I mean, old school race car drivers, when at some point it clicks in their head, they're not out there for show. And Bruce's car came in with some tire marks from Brian Redman's 908. So they were not messing around. Um, there's always comments on how American historic racing is more of a parade compared to like Goodwood, where they really thrash on the cars. But there's real racing going on. These are real race car drivers in real race cars. They can't help themselves. Um, but that's a good question. Let's see. Where is chassis 23 now? You said it was out there. It's out there. I believe it's a private owner that owns chassis 23. Um, and I think they also built another copy of it. This might be wrong, and I always trying to say that if I'm not totally sure. But they built like a replica chassis and put some real 917 stuff into it and dressed it up so that you could see the 917, that car, that livery, the Salzburg livery out there racing, and they do run that car. Oh, that just leads me to where was it at? People ask me about are there clones of these? Any worth building? And then what's your take on the Icon Engineering's 917 replicas? Are they worth the asking price? So there are replicas out there. That's a replica, but it's like a tool replica where it's a well, literally an exact copy of a 917. Uh, the hard part about building a replica, really, in most cars, like the replica I would own in a heartbeat is the Jaguar XJ13. Um, but they only made so many quad cam V12s, and I'm never going to have one in that car. But you're not going to get a 917 motor unless you have one sitting around. So these ones usually have the six-cylinder Porsche motors in them. That, like we mentioned earlier in Herbie, there's the Laser 917. There were some great fiberglass, Volkswagen-based ones back in the 70s, and you can still find those. A friend of mine saw one on the side of the road, and he's all, "It's a 917. Do you want to buy it?" I'm like, that's just a plastic copy. LMK Craftwork did some replicas were pretty amazing, and the Icon one is what they've done is they've taken a lot of modern computer technology and copy the 917, and you can get those from just like the body and the chassis for like I forget, it's like 80 grand or something like that. You can get a finished one for quarter of a million. When it comes to replicas, I like replicas, especially if they're relatively accurate. I'm working on a Jag D type replica right now, and it gives you 90% of the original experience. But instead of sitting in a $20 million car, you're sitting in a $200,000 car. That seems to be a lot of value in that for me. Or building one yourself. There was one in LA that I saw that was powered by a Subaru flat six, and I heard of one where they actually put two Subaru sixes together and try to make a Subaru flat 12. Maybe somebody out there knows more about that than I do, but I heard about that. That sounded really cool. Um, let's see. 917-019 is on display at the Revs Institute in Naples alongside some other great cars. Well, the Revs Institute is amazing. Hats off to any of these great people who kind of build these collections and allow us to see them and share them with everybody and keep the cars running and alive. It's so important that the next generation gets to see the cars, experience them, and especially bring them to life. Like if you can see one ever fire up, go to a race, listen to it. The flat 12 makes a sound you just can't describe. It's fantastic. Um, what made the brakes so revolutionary for the time? I believe you mentioned them in other videos and AMCs. Yeah, somebody else asked that question online, and the the brakes were well, they were huge. They were the biggest brakes Porsche had ever made, and I believe the sports car required that all four corners be the same size brakes, but I might be wrong on that. But they did start bringing in cross drilled brakes, and cross drilling lightened the disc itself. It also allowed for air movement and ventilation through it. It also was prone to crack. I mean, these are very early ones, and people worried about that. So you'd see 917s racing, and some of them would have solid discs because they didn't want to race the crazy ones. But they were massive brakes, huge calipers. I know they worked with Girling on them. Um, it was just a huge step forward in braking technology, because really all a brake is a rotor and two big things clamping down on it, and it just, the bigger it can be, the more heat, the bigger the rotor, the more heat it can take, the more heat it can radiate, and then clamp it down. Nothing compared to the modern brakes today. Supercars have, the ceramic brakes that are the size of pie tins. Uh, Obviously would outbrake it, but that technology, that 917 brake, did run in the Javelin. I talk about that in the cheating video. They did put 917 brakes. 917 brakes also became Porsche 935 brakes. So it was, they used that technology for years. They were massive, massive, big, heavy brakes. Okay. Is the fuel unit in front of the cabin? What is the constructed with? What is it approximate capacity? I don't know the fuel capacity of it, and I'd imagine it was different in some of the cars. I know the Can-Am cars had multiple tanks. The Can-Am cars actually had the fuel tanks on either side of you, kind of like, your protective zone on either side of these massive fuel tanks. But I'll have to look that one up, what the 917 fuel tank capacity was. These were endurance cars, so they had to carry quite a bit of fuel. And the Can-Am cars, I believe, they had to run the whole race on one tank, so they had a lot of fuel in them. Let's see. Am I getting through all these? We're doing pretty good, I think. Yeah. I'm good. How long have I been talking? Come on, YouTube, tell me. Oh, I've been talking for 37 minutes. Man, this guy can yammer. Let's see. Shift knob, 917, replicas, power. Um, were the Can-Am cars developed solely by the Americans, or was the Porsche Salzburg involved in them as well? So the Can-Am was an American series, and in 19 they did bring some of the early 917s to Can-Am as Porsche in the early years to kind of feel it out. And you'll see sometimes they'll have done a race weekend with the endurance car, and then they would just throw the 917K into a Can-Am race just to put it in there, and test it out. And they built an early version of it called the 917 PA, which I believe stood for Porsche Audi. And that car was an open body car, like a kind of the beginning of the kind of Can-Am look. And then they got into then what happened was Penske, who was an amazing American race team, got the nod to run the team in 72 and 73, and they worked very closely with Porsche developing that car. Mark Donohue, who is one of my racing heroes, because he was not only a race car driver but an engineer. Like, he'd be able to, come back into the pits and give incredible information, and then design things himself. And the story goes that he spent, an immense amount of time in Germany working with the Germans on the 91710 when they were developing it, enough that it put his marriage in trouble. He was a very focused, amazing individual, but it was a work between Penske and Porsche. So the Salzburg team only lasted from until the end of 1970, and I believe they were bought out completely by Martini, or there was a transition there. I forget how that worked, but so there was no Salzburg team that would have been around for Can-Am at that point. Now remember, Can-Am had its sister kind of series in Europe called the Inner Series, and they raced the same cars. A lot of them 91710s without turbochargers. And a lot of people always think of the turbocharged 91710. They were non-turbocharged versions of that race back in the day. Woo! How long should I go with this? Um, have you ever spent time talking to Hurley Haywood? Briefly. The man's a legend. If you don't know who he is, look him up. He's one of the greatest endurance race car drivers of all time. Le Mans winner, and I've met him a few times. I got to interview him once for my friend Kelly Telfer when he bought the Bahama Mama, and just a really pleasant, amazing guy. Stories. There's a great book about him. Another great book. More books by Sean Cridlin, my friend Sean Cridlin, and about Hurley Haywood. You just look it up. It is a fantastic book, and it starts at the beginning of his life, goes all the way through his racing career, working at Brumos with Peter Gregg. It's amazing. Just that's kind of cool. I get off on tangents. I'm sorry. Let's see your questions here. Um, Jin says you're late. No one's late. This will be available later. Don't worry about being late. Please do this with a 935 next time. Absolutely. I'm totally going to do a video on the 935. We'll do 930. Probably do a video on the development from the RSR to the 934, 934 and a half, 935. Those just ferocious cars. And again, I got to spend some time close to a lot of those working at Canepa. And if you ever get to see Bruce race his 935, which he's owned since new, do that. The man's an animal, and that car's an animal. It's amazing to watch. One of his races, he started from last in the historics, and I think in 6 laps was in the front. It was tremendous. Was the 917 flat 12 ever used in another car? I don't believe so. That engine served its life. Remember, the engine was built specifically for this 5-liter category. And when somebody asked what happened, why it went away, they changed the regulations to 3 liters. So in '72, you couldn't race a 5-liter. So the flat 12 kind of went by the wayside. The 6s came in, turbocharging came in. Although the 917, it did. I kind of allude to in the video that was the end in '71. It did obviously live on as the Can-Am car, but what people forget is it also lived on as the 936 prototype. That is based on a lot of 917 parts are under that skin. So that did, but that ran on a 6-cylinder engine. So I don't think so. I don't think the 12 ran. I might be wrong, but I can't think off the top of my head another car that ran that motor. And by the time years later, it's outdated. There's engines only have a certain life, unless of course you're Jaguar with the XK motor, which ran from the 40s to the 90s, but they're Jaguar. Ferrari and Porsche can't get away with that. All right, I think I'm getting to the end of this. Let me just check a few more folks out there. The street legal, we talked about the street legal cars already, and fuel units, and I thought all of them were magnesium. So we'll go back to that. No, they weren't magnesium. The frames were aluminum. Before the 917, they used the same tubular chassis, but they were steel. Then they built it out of aluminum. These were magnesium, magnesium being lighter, but a little more fragile. There were a few magnesium cars. That was kind of state-of-the-art stuff back in the day. Let me see if I missed anything. All right, I think we got most of them. If I've missed anything, I apologize. I think 45 minutes is probably a great time to end this. I really appreciate you guys watching. I appreciate the support for my new channel. Hopefully it'll grow. I'm open to suggestions. I think it's a two-way street. So, you tell me what you want to see and I'll see what I can make for you. I'm working on a video that'll come out soon. My first history video for my channel, which will be on the Audi Quattro Trans Am car of 1988, one of my favorite cars. Yeah, I do other things but Porsche. So that'll be coming out soon. We're working on a whole lot more content. We'll do more garage stuff. We'll do everything. And then as my VINwiki videos come out, and there's a few more to come, I'll be doing live response videos like this to so we can have a little conversation about cars and be geeks together. So again, thank you for watching. Please, if you haven't, like and subscribe and all of that YouTube stuff. And have yourself a great day and go be a car geek.